Hello, and welcome to Booked on Shalom World TV, where we introduce Christian books. I'm your host, Clare Hinshaw. Today we are speaking with Dr. Bob Schuchts, the best-selling author of Be Healed, Be Transformed, Be Devoted, and the book we'll be discussing tonight, Be Restored, Healing Our Sexual Wounds Through Jesus Merciful Love. Dr. Schuchts is the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center in Tallahassee, Florida, and co-host of the Restore the Glory podcast with Jake Kitt. After receiving his doctorate in family relations from Florida State University in 1981, Dr. Schuchts became a teacher and counselor. While in private practice, he also taught graduate and undergraduate courses at Florida State and Tallahassee Community College. Dr. Schuchts later served on the faculty at the Theology of the Body Institute and at the Center for Biblical Studies, where he taught courses on healing, sexuality, and marriage, and was a guest instructor for the Augustine Institute. He volunteered in parish ministry for more than 30 years. Well, Dr. Schuchts, welcome to Booked. We're delighted to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I'm very happy to be here and honored to be invited.
Oh, well, wonderful. Well, I'd like to start off with something that jumped out to me right at the beginning of the book, where you say that we all have sexual wounds. And that was something that kind of surprised me. So I'd love if you could share a little bit about what exactly you mean by that.
Yeah, that's a question. As I was praying and starting the book, that I started off thinking my audience was smaller. And then as I began to write it, I began to realize that this really touches everybody's life. And it's, I think, twofold. One is because we live in a broken world, and part of God's design for our sexuality has been so distorted over time, and particularly in our time, that we don't realize how much that's wounded us, how our masculinity has been wounded, our femininity has been wounded, how our sexual relationships, how our understanding of sexuality is wounded by those experiences. And it's things like the media wounds us, the culture and the beliefs about the culture. I talk about two kinds of sexual wounds in the book. I talk about psychosexual wounds, the wounds in our development and the way that we come to understand ourselves in our masculinity and femininity. And I think everybody's affected in that way. But also then the kind of wounds that happen by sexual violations of God's will in our life. And our own sin, any sin that we have, any sexual sin wounds us, as well as the people around us. But it's also the things that have happened to us can wound us, whether it's in our mind and imagination or in actually the violations that happen by sexual aggression or incest or those kind of things. So I think there's a real gamut here of wounds that we all can experience.
Well, kind of going off of that last question, you mentioned the media a little bit and our current culture. And I'm wondering if you think, is this something that sort of is endemic to human nature and throughout human history, that these sexual wounds are so rampant, or is this more a phenomenon of our current time and culture?
Yeah, and I think it's both. I really think that as a result of original sin, every culture has had sexual wounds and sexual distortions. So all we have to do is read all the way through the scriptures, and everywhere in the Old Testament, so many of the chastisements that happened from the time of the beginning till the end of the Old Testament are from sexual sin and sexual wounds that develop from those sexual sins. I think of Tamar with her half brother, and David's own adultery, and just the worship of Ashtoreth and Baal. That's filled the Old Testament. But if we will look honestly at even the New Testament, even after Jesus came, St. Paul is constantly addressing sexual wounds and sexual sins in the culture. And we look at the cultures that he lived in, the Greek culture, the Roman cultures, they were really beset by sexual sin, and it was a part of the deterioration of the culture. But I think in a very unique way, as I've lived my 60-some years, I have seen a tremendous increase in sexual woundedness, tremendous increase in sexual sin and distortion also. And I think even in the church, now with the media, we not only have the propagation of sexual distortion throughout the world, but we also have the sexual wounds that have happened in the church that is publicized all over the world. So we're really beset. So even if an individual person can't identify their own sexual woundedness, just living in the church right now and the broken trust that's happened is a sexual wound. Believe it or not, that's a sexual wound for all of us that we all experience.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting times we're living in.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier thinking through who your audience was for the book, and that was something I was curious. Obviously, the book is helpful for those dealing with their own sexual wounds, but is it something that you would also recommend for those trying to help others in their lives, loved ones who are dealing with sexual wounds? Is that something you think could be helpful?
Yes, definitely. I've gotten feedback from family members, from therapists, from pastors, from others who work with people, say, in rape crisis centers, how helpful the book has been for them having an understanding of what those who are going through who they're helping. But a surprising thing happens as they're reading. They begin to realize something that I realized as I was helping other people over the years. And I thought I was helping them, didn't think I had any sexual wounds. And as I helped people and saw all the different kinds of sexual wounds that there are, I began to realize that those were in my life as well. And so one of the things that I've encouraged to those who are helping others is to first examine for themselves how this applies in their own life. And I think there's a synergy that takes place that as they're helping others, they're going to see it more clearly. But also as they see it more clearly in their own life, they're going to have a greater compassion and an ability to help those that they're serving.
Wow, that makes so much sense. It actually reminds me of the gospel story when Jesus tells you to take the log out of your own eye before looking for the speck in your brother's. So
Yes.
very interesting. And kind of going off of that, I noticed that at the end of each chapter, you include both reflection questions and what you call personal activities to kind of help the reader. How would you recommend the reader use these? How do you think they can be helpful in working through their sexual wounds?
Yeah, I've had several people tell me that this is really the goal of the book is being able to take the material and really apply it in that way, and both as helping somebody else, but also in your own life. They were designed. I mean, those reflections have occurred in the writing and in years of counseling and teaching those kind of questions. But the activities themselves, I found to be really central to people's healing process. And I wanted to write this book so that people can not just get an understanding, but also engage in a healing process and experience a very real encounter with Jesus in the places where they have sexual sin or sexual wounds. You know, kind of like in the Gospels where the woman who's caught in adultery, and Jesus comes to her and he ministers to her woundedness and her shame. And so the reflection questions are ways that we can enter in with our own life, the areas that we're identifying, and then having real encounter through the Holy Spirit with Jesus in the present moment. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And I put a lot of prayers in the appendix of the book too that go along with those activities. And those prayers are things that I've learned over the years in my own life and then helping others.
Wow, it sounds like this book has been many years in the making, lots of love and experience in the making.
It has been.
Well,
Yes.
well, before I let you go, there was one particular chapter I wanted to touch on, which is you talk about gender and sexuality, and that has become such a big issue in our current culture. So I would love to hear from you how you recommend Christians respond to this current real crisis with gender expression and gender identity.
Well, first of all, I think to first of all recognize how much we've all been affected, even if we don't agree with it. it's just permeating the culture. And there's the first effect is confusion. You know, what is true, what is not true. And again, our biblical faith tells us, our Catholic faith tells us what's true. But there's also ways in which it seeps in. So, for example, when I'm meeting with somebody who's under 30 years old, they've been brought up in a culture where this is more the norm. And they don't realize how much their own thinking has been influenced by just the ways in which the culture has defined sexuality. Similarly, you know, in the last 60 years, since the sexual revolution, we don't realize how much that's affected the sexual images that we see, the access that we have to those sexual images, the distortions that have happened because of the breakdown of the family, repeated sexual experiences. All those affect the way we see ourselves. And so one of the things I talk about in the chapter is early on in our sexual development, every child needs to have a healthy attachment with mother and father. And if they have that healthy attachment, they naturally identify with the same-sex parent. It's in our nature. But when that's disrupted, when there's not two parents there, or when one or the other parent is not somebody safe to attach to, then there becomes a process like disidentification, like I'm not going to be like that. And whenever we do that, even without real gender dysphoria or confusion, we can get into a loss of confidence in our own identity as male and female, as a beloved son and beloved daughter. And so this really is affecting all of us in ways that we don't really see, which are some of the sexual wounds. And then when we see in the extreme forms, you know, the gender dysphoria and transgender surgeries and those kind of things, now we've really crossed over a line, and I call that in the book abuse. It's sexual abuse that's happening in our culture, both from an ideology standpoint, but also from a practice, you know, with the hormones and the surgeries and those kind of things. So it's, as Christians, we need to be well informed about the truth, also very compassionate to every individual who suffers, because our battle is not against the people, it's against the principalities and powers that are influencing the culture, and that has really deceived so many of the people in the culture. This is the introduction to Be Restored. The conference room overlooking the rolling Amish countryside in southeastern Pennsylvania quickly filled to capacity. The nervous energy and anticipation in the room was palpable as the students settled into their seats. I felt honored to be invited to teach this course on sexual healing and redemption for the Theology of the Body Institute, and grateful to be accompanied by my good friend, Father Mark Toops, who would serve as our chaplain for the week. After nearly 3 years of preparing the material for this course, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. My own feelings were compounded by the rising anxiety among the students that permeated the atmosphere of the retreat center. Most had taken other courses at the Institute, but they somehow intuited that this course was going to involve a deeper immersion into their sexual brokenness before experiencing the healing and redemption that the course had title promised. Sensing the nervousness among the students, Father Mark wisely opened with a prayer, welcoming the Holy Spirit's presence. He then offered a few words of exhortation that brought immediate peace to the participants and to me as I prepared to give an overview of the material. Here is a paraphrase of Father Mark's opening remarks. It is normal to feel anxious as we begin this course, as we address our sexual brokenness. We all have sexual wounds, and for some of us, these may run very deep. But you don't need to muster more courage right now. Courage is not the opposite of fear. The opposite of fear is communion. The only answer to your fear and anxiety is the knowledge that Jesus is here, intimately present with us. He will personally walk with each of you through these 5 days. Hard to think about when an early experience of that, but I remember loving to read as a child. And noticing that through what was written, you could be brought anywhere. You could realize in a story or in what was written that your imagination could go to places, and realizing the connection between being able to express something in language and then being able to imagine it was an early experience. Yeah, that's really hard also to define, because my research is lifelong. It's life experience as well as reading over years on a particular topic as a teacher, as a professor, and meeting with people and the experiences that I have with people, and then my own prayer life. And so that's all part of the background. And then as I begin a book, it's usually because all of this has been gathered in workbooks and those kind of things. And so I have all this material for all the courses and conferences that I've taught. And then it's just distilling it down and then getting current input if the workbooks were written a couple years earlier, to get current, up-to-date input. And so that process can take a long time. Like in this case with Be Restored, the course that I taught was at the Theology of the Body Institute was 12 years before the book was written. And that research was 3 years formally, but it was probably 15, 20 years in the making before that. So it's an ongoing process. I love so many Catholic books. I probably anything by Father Jacques Philippe, in book Interior Freedom. For a period of time, Henry Nouwen was one of my favorite authors. But I've loved so much. It's really hard to categorize anything on healing, anything on theology, anything. I love stories. I really love reading. So it's hard to narrow it down. But those two authors are probably some of my favorites. Dr. Scott Hahn was also somebody I've read quite a bit of when I was teaching apologetics. A story brings you into the experience of another person. And as you hear somebody else's experience, it awakens your own awareness of your own story in some cases. And in some cases, it allows you to see the difference, to recognize and appreciate and have compassion for somebody who had a different experience than me. So it's both enlightening to my own experience, but also enlightening to what other people experience that I didn't know about until I could experience it through their story. I think it was what I learned in the process of being formed in the book more than the writing of it. In being formed in the writing of the book, just the growth in my own understanding in my own life, and the experience of my own sexual wounds, and the insights that provided of areas of my life as I grew over time, and ways that I related to people. And so that was surprising. The other thing that I think was surprising is in all the stories I tell in writing the book, just the way that God surprises us in every moment. It's like in each of those stories, just to see the way God moved in the lives of each of the individual people is always a surprise, because it's always beyond my capacity to envision it. And God does it in such a way that it's God.
Well, Doctor, we could obviously talk much longer. There's so much to get into here, but thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into the book, and I hope our viewers will take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. They're good, thoughtful questions. I enjoyed it.
Dr. Bob Schuchts' book, Be Restored, was an unexpected but providential means for deep healing and sexual woundedness in my life. This was all a culmination of many years of counseling, spiritual direction, many layers of other healing in my life that has led to this past December me going on a 24-hour personal retreat. And coming across this book on the coffee table, God led and spoke to me through the articulation of Dr. Bob's words that brought deep validation, understanding, spoke against isolation that I've felt so much in the sexual abuse I have encountered, or the disordered ways in which I saw my identity as a woman and daughter. God used the language of Dr. Bob's book, Be Restored, to bring validation, understanding, all mixed with the psychological realm and spiritual realm that led to the means of a prayer ministry in the back of this book that God used to reach into these core memories, core vows, core areas of woundedness that I experienced, reached in with his loving hand and healed those very places. To places where I vowed against never letting men be in my life or letting them get close. God brought healing into my relationships with men, brought healing into my relationships with my own mother, in different areas of disordered attachments. He brought orderly detachment and love and proper love to my mother. All areas of sexual abuse that I encountered, God reached into those through this prayer ministry and Be Restored in the book that was all led and ordained by the Lord to make me whole. Once where I thought I was a woman that was growing in holiness, was disintegrated from a little girl that was ashamed and confused of her identity, of her purpose, of where she belonged. God used this book to bring integration of wholeness in my life, wholeness of my identity, wholeness of who I belong to and where I belong in the Lord's arms, has brought deep healing to once where I never would let my father touch me for 20 years. Now I welcome his touch, to the point where I felt disorderly attachments with my mother, now feel orderly detachment and love and servitude towards my mother. Different areas of places where I felt wounded and walls came up, God made me whole. To now, for the rest of my days, from this past December on this healing retreat, God brought and made me whole only with his love and his healing, and brought hope to me through this book that Dr. Bob wrote, Be Restored. And I would recommend this to anyone who lacks hope of healing in their life, for areas where they think that resurrection can't happen. I have experienced firsthand God is healer. God can resurrect what once was broken and make us whole again.
Thank you for joining us for Booked on Shalom World TV. Come back next week for another episode. Until then, happy reading.
Are you searching for purpose of life? Discover your true identity. Stay tuned to Shalom World.